Good morning, Cowboys Nation, and welcome to another episode of the Writer's Block podcast. I'm your host, David Howman, joined once again by Brandon Clements, and we have a special guest today as well, one of the OG co-founders of the Writer's Block podcast. You've heard her all over at Girls Talk, Boys Talk with the Dallas Cowboys. Jess Nevarez, welcome back to the show, Jess. Brandon and I have been going through it with the coaching search. And of course, we're recording this Tuesday night. So coming out Wednesday morning, potentially something has changed from this point where we started recording to when this comes out. Who knows? But Jess, how are you doing in general, but also, in Cowboys world with what feels like, it's been months of this coaching search and it's really only been a week.
Man, it's rough out here. Let me say, it is so hard because I think we kind of all saw it coming, but we didn't understand what we were in for. Because I also feel like when you go back to when Jason Garrett was fired, you knew there was a safety net waiting. And, reports came out afterwards of how Jerry had his eye on McCarthy at that point and yada, yada, yada. But I feel like you knew you weren't waiting long. I felt like you just got the vibe from Jerry back then. There's a plan, everything's set. I didn't get that at all this year. And when the decision was made in McCarthy's terms, I think that kind of really threw things for a loop that Jerry Jones wasn't necessarily expecting, because from what it sounds like, it was on McCarthy's terms to decide not to return, which good for him. I mean, genuinely good for him. Go get your bag, go get what you deserve, King. We love that. We love that for you. But also, I wasn't too surprised to hear that McCarthy made that decision, just based on even looking back at the press conferences and the times he would speak to the media in the last, I would say, month of the season. It just kind of seemed apparent that it was time for him personally to move forward. And so if it was up to me, McCarthy would have stayed. But clearly it was not up to me. So all that to say, it's just been a long couple of weeks. I think we're still in for a long next couple of weeks. And I hope that they figure this out sooner rather than later, for the domino effect that it has of needing to find a head coach and the staff that follows.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting, especially since we had, the NFL coaching cycle had its first real big domino fall on Monday with Lions offensive coordinator Ben Johnson accepting the Bears job. Likely means that a few other teams are going to start making decisions in the coming days. Now, Brandon, you also came around after a very, very, very long time of me explaining to you why you were wrong.
Not the victory. It's only been 3 whole minutes, guys. We were doing so good.
I know.
But you came around by the end of this year on they should bring Mike McCarthy back. And sure enough, the moment that you come around and get on his side, they part ways. Of course, you weren't here last week. I assume mourning the loss of Mike McCarthy, who you suddenly become the biggest fan of. And then, you come on today and, you're recovering from the flu. And so you are literally sick with this coaching search, just as all of us metaphorically are physically sick with how these things are unfolding. Is that wrong for me to characterize it that way?
No, not at all, honestly. I mean, yes. I mean, sick is the word these days. I didn't have my Michael Jordan flu game or anything like that, but and Mike McCarthy, it was the whole domino effect. And you're right. I took a long time to come around to the Mike McCarthy, the idea of him coming back. And for me personally, it took me a while to get there. And it was more so just kind of looking at the coaching marketplace and knowing okay, Mike McCarthy or Coach Y, so to speak. You just go down the list. Ben Johnson, I know he's a favorite of many, and obviously he just got the job with the Bears. So congrats to Ben. He's been a hot name for the last few years. So congrats to him. The Cowboys were never in it. It was never going to be a conversation that was going to be had. So it was if we're not going to get a guy like that, or for me, like an Aaron Glenn was another name that I really liked. I've always, I respect, I'm the elder statesman of the three of us. So I actually watched Aaron Glenn play football, like, back in the day when he was a really good player for the Jets, very good corner. I was like, man, that'd be kind of cool to bring him in. Like he also, he's a Texas guy. Like he played for the Cowboys at the latter stages of his career. So like I've always liked Aaron Glenn. I think he's done a heck of a job with the Lions. So he was the other name. So like it was like essentially the Detroit Lions assistant coaches or Mike McCarthy is kind of how I looked at it. And then like Ben Johnson was not coming, and Aaron Glenn, honestly, like it's going to be the Jets. Like I felt like it was going to be the Jets the entire time. I have a good friend. Paul Boygreen Esden Jr. He's he covers the Jets, and he's been on it since the beginning. And Aaron Glenn's he's going to be a Jet like probably by the next couple days. Like it'll probably come out after we record. It sucks because I really like him, but that's kind of that's where we're at. Bill Belichick went to UNC. And I'm like, well, that was the only other coach that like I was like, okay, like I like Belichick, like that's my guy. Like obviously all the Super Bowls with the Patriots, but that wasn't happening as soon as he went to UNC. So I'm like, okay, it was a domino effect for me, and I'm like, Mike McCarthy's probably the best option at this point. And yeah, the Cowboys did what they do, and it's a circus like it always has been. It's that's what Jerry does. It's Jerry's circus, and even McCarthy didn't really care for how the negotiations were coming out. So it was kind of one of those things. Once those reports came out, it's like it's a joke at this point. So like at this point, who's going to be a better coach than Mike McCarthy was for the Cowboys? That's available that's out there. I don't see that. I don't see anybody out there. Like there's some decent names, which we're going to get into. I know there's a few names out there that we're going to discuss, but it would have been better just to keep in-house, retain Mike Zimmer, obviously keep Al Harris on staff. You add in Jason Witten as a coach somewhere, then I think you could have done something with it. But in typical Jerry Jones fashion, it's been a joke. It's a laughing stock. I'm just, I'm kind of over the whole thing. I just want them to hire a coach, get the staff done, because I'm already sick of it, to be honest.
Literally, you literally are sick of it.
Literally sick, yeah.
I appreciate the fact that you went out and like made yourself ill for this bit that we're doing. That's actually why you're sick. The commitment.
It's the commitment to me.
Full commitment.
It's unreal. But yeah, I mean, like Jess said, it sounds like this caught Jerry by surprise. The fact that Mike McCarthy was not gonna, just be overly grateful for, oh, thank you, please, a 2-year contract with, pennies on the dollar kind of extension, whatever it is. And I mean, we saw like that first night, suddenly it breaks. Oh, he's on a phone call with Deion Sanders. Deion Sanders is interested, and then of course
circus,
they get the Kellen Moore interview in just under the wire before his playoff game. But of course, the Eagles did what they always do, which is win despite playing really, really poorly. So they're in the conference championship game, meaning the Cowboys have to wait at least another week to potentially be able to hire him. Everyone at that point made it seem like, oh, Kellen Moore, like he's obviously the top candidate. Like they're going to hire him the second he's available. Then Monday comes around. Monday morning, the Vegas sports books put out their odds for the Cowboys, and the new name at the top of the list is incumbent offensive coordinator Brian Schottenheimer, and everyone goes, what? And then on Tuesday, suddenly it comes out that they are interviewing Brian Schottenheimer for the head coaching vacancy, and Twitter, Blue Sky, internets all around, blow up. Everyone's talking about like, oh, this is going to be the guy. Like they're going to bring in Schottenheimer. And of course, they've conducted several other interviews. I mentioned Kellen Moore. They talked to former Jets head coach Robert Saleh on, I believe, Saturday. Mm-hmm. On Monday, they interviewed former Vikings head coach, current Seahawks assistant head coach Leslie Frazier, and then Schottenheimer on Tuesday. From a procedural standpoint, they have now satisfied the Rooney Rule requests, which means at this point they are free to hire any coach who they so desire, which could be Brian Schottenheimer. A lot of times we see teams will schedule the interview with whoever it is that they actually want to hire for after they've become Rooney Rule compliant, so that they can do the interview, make the offer, sign the contract. And that was kind of the prevailing sentiment with the Brian Schottenheimer interview on Tuesday, even though it came out of nowhere for a lot of people on Cowboys Twitter. We're all talking about like Kellen Moore's the guy. Maybe Jerry's going to pivot and go with Deion Sanders because they're buddies and Deion would be a splashy hire. No, you're getting Brian Schottenheimer. Jess, how are you? What is your reaction to the Schottenheimer news coming out of nowhere?
It's about time. I was waiting for it. Like, honestly, I feel like if you were caught by surprise, do you know the patterns here? I mean, it was a matter of time until Schottenheimer was thrown in the hat for this, because keep in mind, like, Jerry has talked nonstop about his relationship with, Schotty's dad going way back, and how he respects his family. And, that's just Jerry's style of coach, is you have the family ties, you have the history, the familiarity. It's just Jerry's type and what he likes to do, right? So I was surprised it took so long, to be quite honest with you. That was the only thing surprising to me, is that it took that long. But overall, I mean, it's kind of, at this point, it's a pro and a con that you don't exactly know what you're going to get with Schottenheimer, because keep in mind, he wasn't calling the play calls this last year. So you don't exactly know what he was as an offensive coordinator, because McCarthy was calling the plays. So what was his real role? How much power did he actually have? How much say did he have? We don't know that. And that goes across the board for DC, OC, special teams, and even position coaches. I just think there were so many questions that you can't point fingers unless it's all across the room, because you don't know who was more at fault, who had the most say, who didn't. Like, I can't fault Brian Schottenheimer as much as I feel like I want to as an offensive coordinator, because he didn't get to actually be your traditional offensive coordinator. So for me, I would like to see him, maybe in that role again before, and as a traditional one, making the playbook, calling the plays, transferring the scheme into his style with Dak. I could fairly base it off of that. Until then, I mean, it's just another big question mark. And if Jerry decides to go that route, I think he would be successful. The locker room does really enjoy Schotty. Dak respects him. Dak has a good relationship with him, and that's the utmost importance for your quarterback to get along with a potential head coach candidate. I think it would be a smooth transition. I just don't know what the impact would be and how big of a splash that would be. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It's just there's too many question marks for me to be very solid on, yes, this is a good choice, or no, this is not. I don't know what he can do for the current locker room that has 20 plus free agents that might follow good coaches to clearly other teams that have had success and are heading to a championship game this coming weekend. So that's a thing. And then I think John Fossil leaving to the Titans, you could see potentially free agents following him that way. He's a coach that I think has that kind of magnetic feel to him that players want to follow. And wherever McCarthy ends up, I think that's another thing. I just think it was a really unfortunate year to have this many free agents and this many coaches kind of dispersed, and your previous coaches doing so well that they're playing each other in the championship game you've been trying to get to. So all that to say, I'm not in or out on Schotty. I don't know enough, but honestly, at this point, I need somebody hired. You need to get ahead of the situation, because you're putting yourself in a really bad situation the closer you cut this to free agency, draft season. It's cutting it too close to where you need a plan in place, and you need the person putting that plan in place. That was a lot. But you can't do that without a head coach. So you're putting yourself behind for next season the longer you wait.
Yeah, it's a tough time to be a Cowboys fan, all in all, right now.
Sending you my love.
as you mentioned with Schottenheimer, of course, and his dad, for those who, aren't maybe familiar with his dad, Marty Schottenheimer, longtime NFL head coach, had 4 different head coaching stints in the NFL. And now that I'm bringing this up, I'm going to blank on all the teams and I'll get something wrong for sure. But I know he was with the Browns. He was with the Chargers. He had 1 year in Washington.
Most of his career was with the Chiefs.
Yeah, most of his career was with the Chiefs. And actually, when he was the Chiefs head coach, he brought in as one of his offensive coordinators at one time, a guy by the name of Paul Hackett, who had been the head coach at the University of Pittsburgh, where Mike McCarthy was the wide receivers coach. He brings McCarthy with him as his QBs coach. That's how McCarthy gets into the NFL. And then Marty's final year in Kansas City is when Brian Schottenheimer joins the team on staff as an offensive assistant. And that was the very first time that McCarthy and Schottenheimer really met. I mean, they met each other, before that, but they worked together on that staff. And of course, McCarthy and Brian Schottenheimer both talked about that history and the familial relationships and everything when Schottenheimer first came to Dallas and when he was first elevated to offensive coordinator. So Brian Schottenheimer is NFL royalty just by that virtue, but he's also been an offensive coordinator several different places. He's been with the Jets under 2 different head coaches. He was in St. Louis with the Jeff Fisher Rams. He also was very briefly in college at Georgia, was with the Seahawks under Pete Carroll, who I talked about as a potential Cowboys candidate last week. I have a lot of thoughts on Brian Schottenheimer, but before I get into that, Brandon, I want to hear your thoughts on him because he didn't call plays, to Jess's point. We haven't he's been there, but we don't really know anything about him as far as his time in Dallas.
Yeah, when it comes to this time in Dallas, we don't know because, like Jess said, McCarthy was calling the shots on the offense. But if you go back to his days with Seattle and years back with the Jets, he was really good at the run game. That was one of his bright spots. I know he was a top 10. If I'm not mistaken, I think he was a top 10 run game for the Seattle Seahawks when he was there. So he's been a tremendous mind. He got his mind molded back in the 90s with the Syracuse Orange. So he learned a thing or two about the running game at Syracuse. But
he had one season at Syracuse, by the way.
That's all he needed. That's all you need. You get enough of that exposure at the great oasis of Central New York, and then you're off to bigger and better things because that's what we do. We just grow talent left and right here. So, but all jokes aside, Marty Schottenheimer was a great coach. We lost him young. In my book, he was in his 70s. He had Alzheimer's, so that was unfortunate. And he was one of those, for me being the elder statesman of the group here. I remember watching him when he was the coach of the Chiefs with Derek Thomas, and another guy that we lost way too soon in life. So I've always had a lot of respect for Marty Schottenheimer, and just because of that alone, the Schottenheimer name is synonymous with football. And Brian's a well-respected guy in the game. So it's not the sexiest hire, but with the Syracuse ties and everything, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think
sorry.
I've seen a lot of negative reaction to Schottenheimer potentially being the head coach for, everything you just said it's not the sexy hire. And I don't think that anybody.
Remember that? Neither was McCarthy at the time. Remember that?
Exactly. Well, and I saw some people that were saying well, how can we consider this guy? Nobody else has even interviewed this guy. What are the Cowboys doing? And, I'll say right now, if I were in charge, I'm probably not hiring Brian Schottenheimer, although he, maybe he impresses me in the interview, who knows? But what I point to is the Eagles, who are, as you mentioned, they're doing pretty good right now. Nick Sirianni, nobody else interviewed him when they hired him. The guy before him, Doug Peterson, nobody interviewed him before they hired him. Both of those guys did pretty good. Doug Peterson won him a Super Bowl. Nick Sirianni's been to the Super Bowl, might go again. So hopefully not. But
don't even speak that into existence. What's wrong with you?
I'm just saying, statistically speaking,
say that. No.
He's got a 50-50 shot of being there.
No, we're rooting for Dan Quinn.
Yes.
Me?
Who
Like,
also to that point,
hello?
Dan Quinn was not the Commanders' first choice. They wanted Ben Johnson. And we've seen many, many times where like the hot coaching candidate, teams get him, and Josh McDaniels has been the hot coaching candidate twice, and he's been horrible both times. I remember when Hugh Jackson took the Browns job, there were so many articles written about like the Browns finally got it right. And then he won 1 game his first year, 0 games the next year. So
Josh is back in the game too. I mean,
Josh is back in the game
Patriots.
as the Patriots offensive coordinator, but he
He
probably
always
will not get a third head coaching shot. But I'm not too terribly moved by the argument of like, well, nobody else is talking to him, nobody else has him on their radar.
honestly,
you both make great points about his personality.
Good.
Yeah.
Keep him off your radar, because look, if he's not leaving as a head coach, keep him in Dallas. Like, these players deserve a sense of some kind of stability. And I worry about like your second, third year players, like new coordinator, new position coach. Like, there's just been no sense of stability. So people that are so down and out about these younger players and their development, it's not going to get any better if you keep changing up coaches every other year. Like, you need a sense of stability to give some kind of relief to not only these coaches and make it a sexy hire to want to go coach in Dallas, but also to give relief to the players in the locker room of, hey, I can play for this guy. I want to play for this guy. And i.e., look what Dan Quinn does. That Dan Quinn effect is such a real thing. And I knew as soon as he went to Washington, it was basically like Cowboys 2.0, but actually like doing what they need to do,
They also got a good quarterback in the draft too, so that doesn't hurt.
Well, but how many rookie quarterbacks could get to this point, to the NFC Championship? Like, that's special, and I give that credit to how he's being coached too, to the preparation to get a rookie quarterback there. Like, I don't know. I don't even think that's an argument of like, other people haven't talked to him. Okay.
Right.
Like, but if he does good, guess who's going to be getting phone calls next year? You haven't seen enough of him to have the appeal for other people to even talk to him. Like, he didn't even call the plays. So why would other people call him? Like, that's a weird argument. Honestly, if he's a great head coaching hire, leave him alone. Like, get out of here.
I mean, nobody was calling for Dan Campbell to be a head coach.
And look what happened.
Well, actually, sorry, there was one person, and that was me. So toot my own horn there.
Yeah, go ahead.
But
they're no longer in the playoffs, so it doesn't really matter.
I think most Cowboys fans would take Dan Campbell in Dallas in a heartbeat, though.
I mean, compared to who else, though? Like, are you talking like this is an imaginary world where every head coach in the NFL is up for grabs? Because he wouldn't be like my first choice, but he'd be a top 5.
Oh, yeah. No, I mean, if every single current head coach is available, I'm probably going with Sean McVay. But
really?
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, who are you guys going with?
Shanahan tree, baby. Like, can't defeat him? Bring him in. Grab him. Keep him in. Like,
you guys are gonna hate me.
Get him.
You're gonna hate me for this one, but he's never been under 500 as a coach. Mike Tomlin.
I don't hate you for that.
Yeah, I don't hate you for that.
I mean, as a Cowboys fan, it's hard for me to say that because it's a Steeler. But Mike Tomlin's one of the most respected coaches. He's the longest tenured coach. Him and the AFC North. I mean, John Harbaugh's another name. I mean,
Andy Reid.
Andy Reid's been around a long time.
Andy Reid would be fun. Is Patrick Mahomes coming with him?
Yeah, right.
Is Travis Kelce coming with?
But
maybe some Super Bowls. I don't care.
Either way, none of these guys are coming to Dallas, and I think that's kind of what has been laid bare by this whole process too. I mean, Ben Johnson was never going to be interested in Dallas. Aaron Glenn probably was not going to be interested in Dallas. I mean, there's multiple coaches that have. I mean, Mike Vrabel took the Patriots job, didn't even wait to see if Cowboys is going to come open. Like, the way people talk about the Cowboys vacancy, it's like one of those where if it really was that great and everybody wanted it, like guys like Vrabel and Johnson would have waited. They didn't. And I think that's kind of why we're seeing at this point that, not to say that like, I don't want this to be an insult to Brian Schottenheimer, but like this is one of the reasons why they're like, well, okay, let's talk to the guy who nobody else is talking to, because that's more in our wheelhouse, in our price range, if you want to go that route too of coaches' salaries. And for me, as someone who has been so strongly in support of Mike McCarthy for so long, it does feel very validating, because I made the argument so many times throughout this past season of, well, one, I thought they should have brought him back just because I think he's a good coach. But two, the same point that Jess, you made, and Brandon, you as well, in coming around on him, which is you're not going to get an upgrade out there. Like the guys that are better than him, like genuinely better, are one, not available because Mike Tomlin's staying in Pittsburgh, right? Andy Reid's staying in Kansas City. Yeah. And the ones who are, like Ben Johnson, there's going to be better opportunities. Yeah. And now we're, so many fans were like, let's get rid of Mike McCarthy because I want change. And now he's gone. And you're like, well, our choices are between Kellen Moore, Brian Schottenheimer, which, by the way, I think
don't get me started.
I feel like they're the same coach. Like when you look at their profiles, like not personality wise, they're very different people. But coaching like schemes, they're both coaches' sons. They're both guys who have been around the game, literally their entire life, have always been people who have raved about their football mind and their football intelligence. Yeah. Only difference is Brian Schottenheimer has a lot more experience, and Kellen Moore is the hot name, whereas Schottenheimer is not. He doesn't have a good PR team. But I mean, you
that's
look
a long year, okay? Like that's 365 days more experience. All right, that's what I'm hearing. That's a big number.
Yeah.
Yeah, Shoddy's been in the coaching game when I think Kellen Moore was in elementary school. Let's be honest.
No, he's absolutely more experienced. But I'm just saying from when you break down their profiles, I'm like the weaknesses that you can point to about Kellen Moore, which is largely like inexperience. He's going to be Jerry's puppet. He's never been a head coach. Offense has been inconsistent here and there. You can say pretty much the same things about Brian Schottenheimer. I mean, he was with the Jets. Like I said, he was hired by Eric Mangini. His first year they were actually pretty good. The next year, Chad Pennington, their quarterback, gets hurt. Not a great year. Next year they bring in Brett Favre, and they were pretty good, but Favre retired for like the fifth time. And then Rex Ryan comes in, keeps Brian Schottenheimer. Of course, Rex was the one who kind of coined, like, we're going to have the ground and pound offense.
Yeah.
They draft Mark Sanchez. And first 2 years, they go to the AFC Championship game both times. And Mark Sanchez looks like he might actually be something. That was Schottenheimer calling the plays. And then eventually they move on from him because Sanchez wants to throw the ball more, so they changed up their offense. Did not work out. And then, of course, he goes to the Rams. When he gets there, I think Sam Bradford was coming off of his Offensive Rookie of the Year award. So it was like, Jeff Fisher wants to run the ball, but also they have a young quarterback. That first year, Sam Bradford, statistically, it's still the best year of his career. And then the next year, he tears his ACL halfway through the year. Year after that, he tears his ACL again in the preseason. So the numbers for Schottenheimer's offenses with the Rams weren't great. But again, you look at the quarterback situation, it wasn't going to be good in that situation. And you look at Seattle, and I did a lot of research on his time with the Seahawks back when the Cowboys brought him in as offensive coordinator because it fascinated me. And I tweeted this out right before we hopped on to record. From 2018 to 2020 is when he was calling the plays in Seattle. Statistically, to this day, is still Russell Wilson's best years of his career. Also, over that 3-year stretch, Seattle was 6th in EPA per play on offense and 9th in offensive success rate. This is pretty good. And they had some years where they were more run heavy, some years where they were more pass happy. You saw a lot of different things there, but that was with him calling the plays. It was also with Mike Solari as the offensive line coach, who's now in Dallas as well. He came over when Schottenheimer did. So I look at that and I'm like, okay, so is it like it's not a Ben Johnson run on offense, But is it some of the ways that people talk about Schottenheimer and his offense and his play calling is like, it's like he's, the second coming of Scott Linehan. And he's just not. Like he's had some really, really good years, and he's had some years that weren't so great. And then he's had some years that were ruined by quarterback injuries. And we also don't even know if he would necessarily call plays as head coach, or if he would delegate that to someone else and take on more of a leadership role. So, I mean, we really don't know anything other than the fact that he interviewed for the job.
Here's my thing, though.
I'm open to finding out.
What if he follows McCarthy? Because to me, that could also seem logical. Of if McCarthy gets the Saints head coaching position, is he going to follow? Like, I also am not putting a stamp on this because I think it's very McCarthy dependent based on their personal relationships with family ties. Like, McCarthy always has praised Brian's dad and how much respect he's had for that entire family. So for me, it kind of is up to Shotty if he wants to take on the role as the Dallas Cowboys head coach, which is very different than a head coach anywhere else, or you follow what you know is true, what works for you and in McCarthy, and you go somewhere else and kind of take that route to potentially be the guy that gets multiple calls for that head coaching position when time comes. Because to me, his literally the tattoo on his arm says faith, family, football. If you're thinking of terms of family, what's more stable for you? Because so far the track record here doesn't necessarily show stability unless you are winning, which happens during the season. But how lenient is Jerry going to be with this next head coach? If you don't get to the NFC Championship, especially because the Commanders and the Eagles did, are you on the chopping block right after that season? Like, that's my question, is how much leniency does this next coach get? And like, I think we all forget these people also have say in what they want to do with their coaching careers as well. And I think Schottenheimer is in a good position where I think he has more leverage than people are even thinking he does with the Cowboys. So I don't know, guys. It's been a long 2 weeks. I foresee this being a long 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Like, I don't know, but I just know I go back to what I said, like, hire somebody, make your decision and stand on it. Because also when you look at the other teams that have been looking for a head coach, the Cowboys are already behind the 8 ball. They've interviewed 4 people. Other teams are in like 10 people, 8 people, 12 people. Like
the Jets have interviewed like the whole city of New York. So
that's what I'm saying. But they want to find the right candidate and they're taking it seriously. That's what that tells me, is we're really feeling out what direction we want to take this organization. And, interviewing, I guess, the least amount of people doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. But to me, it tells me, where's the urgency? Like, or do you already know what you want and you're trying to find it in these specific people? I don't think anything good comes from waiting to hire a head coach, especially with how much the Cowboys have to figure out already. Like, there's not one room on this current roster that I'm not concerned about. There's not one. Every single room has issues that could transpire to, become worse or better depending on who you're hiring. So you need to get your ducks in a row. Like, you need the main duck, you need the mama duck, and all the baby ducks need to follow, because then it also brings up the conversation, who's your offensive coordinator if it's not Schottenheimer? Who's your defensive coordinator? Is Zimmer coming back? Is he calling it a career? What's Zim doing? John Fossil's gone, so who the heck's your special teams coordinator? There's so many questions. And usually I feel like with a head coach, you have a staff that follows you. But if you have a Brian Schottenheimer or maybe even like a Kellen Moore, they don't necessarily have a staff that's worked under them as a head coach to follow that they trust. So you're kind of rebuilding from scratch and figuring out who those guys are, since they're in the younger portion of their coaching careers per se. But man, just hire a coach. Like, I'm so sick of this waiting game. I'm impatient. I'm not a patient person. And this playing games, waiting in limbo, it really makes me wonder what they had planned to do if McCarthy hadn't taken his own free will to like leave that position.
Right. Well, and the other aspect that goes into this too, which is like totally kind of fallen by the wayside with all the Brian Schottenheimer stuff breaking this week, is the rumors and reports of Jason Witten possibly being a part of the next staff. Of course, Jess is pointing to her picture of Jason Witten on her wall behind her. Jason Witten, Cowboys legend, obviously. And I think it was Jane Slater who first reported that part of the conversations Mike McCarthy had with Jerry Jones was Jerry kind of floating this idea of Jason Witten being part of his next staff and essentially grooming him to eventually take over at head coach. And so that's another aspect, as they're talking about, others have said they expect Jason Witten to be part of this staff, whether it's as head coach or position coach or assistant head coach, whatever it may be. Which again is, most teams don't start filling position coach roles before they find their head coach. I think
it's the Cowboys.
With the news of Bones Fossil
with the Cowboys, like
that's
yeah.
Well, and with the news of Bones Fossil going to Tennessee, I also saw, I think it was from Adam Schefter, he said Cowboys made an attempt to keep him at special teams coordinator before he officially signed the deal with Tennessee, which again, like, you don't have a head coach. How are you filling coordinator roles?
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
How do you feel about Jason Witten in general? Like, being a head coaching candidate, being even, part of the staff, groomed for the next head coach. Like, I've seen, a lot of people were like, just hated the idea just because he's been a coach now for, I think, 4 seasons, but on the high school level, he did win state titles in his division the last 2 years in a row. So he's been successful, but it's high school.
Yeah, high school and the NFL, it's obviously it's night and day difference. Obviously, Jason Witten has these great ties, Hall of Famer, one of the greatest tight ends ever play the game. We love Witt. Obviously, he's one of the all-time Cowboys, for me personally. And for me, like, I don't want him as head coach right now. Like, I think that's obvious. I think we all can agree, like, it would not be a good idea to put him in that spot at this stage of the game. But I do think adding him to the staff is a good idea. But like, let's get the head coaching job like filled first, and then they can, like, if it's like a Pete Carroll or somebody, where they can be like, okay, all right, we're gonna put Witt at whatever position coach. Maybe it's a assistant coach or assistant head coach in waiting. I've seen it happen through the years. Like, I've grown up in Syracuse, and we had Jim Boeheim as the basketball coach for like 50 years, and we always had like coach in waiting. So like, whenever he would retire, or whatever the case may be, we knew who the next coach was going to be. So like,
how's that working?
That's why like a guy like Pete, here's the thing, like a guy like Pete Carroll would be perfect though, because he's in his 70s. I mean, he's an older guy. He could be the coach for a couple years. Let Witt get used to to being an NFL coach, and then maybe hand the reins to Jason Witten at that point. Like, maybe that's why they're doing what they're doing. Maybe that's why they're dragging it out, because the way the Cowboys are, the way Jerry Jones thinks is not like the rest of us. Like, it's not really rational thinking. So it's like, he's probably thinking, okay, what coach is going to allow be happy with Jason Witten on the staff and like make it work, kind of a thing. So I think that's part of like the conversations that are being had. Like, that would be my guess, because if he wants Witten on the staff, he's going to get it, but he also wants the head coach to be like on board with it as well. So I would be happy with it. I want a head coach now, like Jess said. Like, I just want it done. Like, I just want somebody on staff, and then whoever it is, if it's like a Pete Carroll, for example, a couple years in, Witten might be ready to rock and roll, because Pete's almost, like, was he almost 75? I think he's getting close to 80.
Almost 74. Yeah. He'll turn 74, I think, in like week 3 of this next season.
So I mean,
happy early birthday. Hell yeah.
I mean, here's the thing. Pete Carroll is not your normal 73, 74-year-old guy. Like, he's very energetic. Like, he's he's not normal like that. Like, and I'm not saying that in a bad way. Like, he's very energetic. So if you get him for a couple years, and then Jason Witten, is like the coach in waiting, that might work. I don't think you're bringing in like a Joe Brady or a Liam Cohn. Like, you're not bringing any of those guys in because the plan is like they're young, hungry coaches. You're going to have the plan is to have them here for a long time, which would totally knock the Jason Witten part out of it, I think, because if you're looking for like a Joe Brady or even like a Bobby Babich, who's another Buffalo Bills coach, like, I mean, they both have done a great job for the Bills. I mean, look where they are right now. So, but at the end of the day, I think if Jason Witten's your coach when Jerry Jones is like 85, then you go with an older coach and then let Jason Witten take over after this next coach.
Jess, are you on the Witten train? And whether or not you are, who's your top preferred candidate for the Cowboys job? Like, if you were the one making the decision, who is it?
Yeah, it's funny because you keep saying Wit and Witten, and my dog responds to both names, so his ears keep perking up.
His ears keep going.
Yeah, he's like, what, Mom? Like, what I do? You're trying to take a nap over here.
Sorry, what?
Like, he's snoring like a grown man, and then he's like, what? You call me? Like, it's so funny. But yeah, no, look, if anyone knows anything about me, y'all know, like, Jason Witten is my dude. That is him and Tony Romo, the reason I fell in love with football. Y'all know that. Like, if you know my story, you know that I'm real big on, I love the former players becoming coaches. I love that cycle, but I just think having him come in as a head coach would be very hasty. Now, I'm never going to say having Jason Witten on staff is a bad thing in any aspect. Like, if they decide to hire him as a head coach, he's going to figure it out, and they will figure it out. Everyone will fall in line. And the good thing about a guy like Jason Witten is he's already a name established. People will listen to him. They will fall into place to figure it out, and he will be a natural leader for that locker room, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. But I think if it's an assistant head coach or a position coach, an offensive coordinator, like, if it's along those lines, I'm a little more intrigued to get him on the track to head coaching, because I also think logistically for a guy like Jason, he started out as the high school football coach for his kids. He got to spend time with his family that he didn't get to during his football career. He's been very vocal about that, and he enjoys his time with his family from what I've heard from interviews. But he also, I feel like, always knew eventually he would get back to coaching within the NFL in some way. And I think we all knew it was obvious that it would always be with the Cowboys. I think at this point, if you get him on staff, you're doing something right. I don't know what the right position would be right off the bat. And I don't personally think it's head coach, but I do think if he's put in that position, it will not be a bad decision. Like, he's going to make damn sure he does what he can with that position to make it great, because that man doesn't do anything that's not great. That's just not Jason's style. And we all know that, being fans of him. We know that. We've watched it. One of the best tight ends to ever play the game. You're not going to be put in a position, where he's going to set you up for failure. So if that's what ends up happening, we'll find peace within it. It'll be fine, right? Like, the sky's not going to be falling by any means. But I would like somebody with more head coaching experience that's been there, done that, worked out the kinks of being a head coach, didn't have to go through the first year, with this specific roster, with this specific quarterback in the position that he's coming out of in this point in his career. I don't want a new head coach to come in here and kind of work out being a first-year head coach ever with this specific situation the Cowboys were in. If Dak Prescott was younger, sure, come on in, figure it out. He has years. The problem is the injury that Dak is coming off of. It can potentially change how he's going to play this game. And you need a head coach that has been there and done that, not necessarily injury-wise, but has seen the progression of a quarterback becoming an older quarterback and respecting that and not making him do more than he needs to do. The quarterback should just be there doing what he needs, not doing everybody else's job. And that's what I fear could happen if you don't have somebody that knows better than to throw it all on Dak. And, Dak feels like he has to put the weight of the world on his shoulders. I just don't think that's setting anybody up for success. But Yeah, look, Jason Witten being on staff, I'm all for it. I 100%. Like, that would be fun for me to watch, honestly. Like, you can't tell me it's not intriguing as hell. If Jason Witten gets hired, you're watching that. Like, and Jerry loves that. Everyone would be like, wait, did he just hire him as a head coach? Like, that's crazy. I have to see what's going on. It keeps the eyes on the Cowboys. Even if he's an OC, guess what you're watching? You're watching how he calls plays. He's a position coach. Guess what you're watching? How the tight ends are playing compared to how they've been playing. Like, either way, you're intrigued to watch what he does because it would be his first year coaching in the NFL. My upstairs neighbors are deciding to throw a party about that, I guess, because they're being very loud. But to answer your question, who I think would be a good candidate, look, we were talking about this before we started recording. I was all for McCarthy staying. I really was hoping that was going to be the case. And since it's not, I think because the younger coaches, the sexy hires, if you will, are already pretty much off the table. And I don't even think they were in the conversation to begin with, if I'm being honest. There was a tweet I sent out a while back. I was like, if you want Ben Johnson in, let's prepare yourself for a lot of disappointment. Y'all need to be realistic. So I think if you're talking as far as a realistic hire that I would be okay with, you're just talking about him earlier, like Pete Carroll. I'm good with an older coach coming in and, maybe not being the long-term solution like we would all like, but he is a stable solution that knows how to operate with quarterbacks getting older and kind of aging and progressing with them. I think he'd be a great choice in that sense for Dak. I also just know that experience would be fantastic. And I do think if somebody like Pete was hired, you see a Mike Zimmer stay at DC and maybe not necessarily call it quits yet. And to me, as much stability as you can keep within what you have left, the better for everybody and the more appealing it will be for your main players who are free agents, and there's a lot of them, to want to come back to this roster. And I will say, if you keep Zim on staff, you're already 3 steps ahead than you were before. But all that to say, I think Pete Carroll would be great as a head coach. And if that's the case, I'd like to see Schotty maybe stay as OC. I'm not opposed to that either. Actually give him control of play calling, because I think that should have happened a long time ago anyways. Do that. And then if not, Jason Witten come in as OC if Schotty decides to go or whatever the case is. I'm just not opposed to any of the position coaches switching around or the OCs. I would love to keep Zim, but I think it all starts with you need a guy that's been there, done that. And also, nothing will surprise Pete Carroll anymore. Man's been through the ringer, so he can handle being a Dallas Cowboys head coach. And for me, you need a sense of, look, we can keep our cool in this position, because that's one thing I appreciated about Mike is he wasn't shaken. He kept his cool with his players. So I think as long as Pete Carroll can kind of modernize his approach with the younger generation, I think all will be well, because I think that's what makes a successful coach. And I think Zim does a good job of that. Is he has his old school ways, but he's also learned to modernize it. And I think that works well with this locker room. So I think Pete Carroll would be ideal, and that'd just be fun. It'd be fun to watch. So
he's a fun character for sure. I of course talked about Carroll last week as well. I predicted that he's going to end up being the head coach. He's also very much in the mix with the Raiders, especially now that Ben Johnson has taken the Bears job instead of the Raiders job. So we'll see how things kind of play out there. I also wrote a piece breaking down Pete Carroll's potential candidacy with the Cowboys, where I talked to 2 different people who cover the Seahawks, Ben Baldwin with The Athletic and Maddie Brown with Seahawks on Tape. And they both said multiple times, of all the potential factors that could be an issue for Pete Carroll being the Cowboys head coach, age is not a problem, because as you've both mentioned, he's still got the energy. Matty Brown even said he was like, if you dyed his hair, people would think he's 50. Like, not a problem there. And also they said, like, just to your point about like being able to like relate to the younger players now, like Ben Baldwin said, like that's the last of the concerns with this guy. There are other concerns, but nobody is perfect, especially at this stage. But he was Brian Schottenheimer was his offensive coordinator for 3 years in Seattle. He has a history, like you said, he's seen everything. And even if he doesn't retain Mike Zimmer necessarily, he is the coach that developed guys like Dan Quinn and Chris Richard. So even if they were to return to that same scheme that he ran, the Cowboys players know it. Like Micah Parsons knows it. I'm still very much a believer that they should do what it takes to keep Mike Zimmer. I think that the defense came on in a huge way in the last few months. But at the same time, like you at least know that these players can thrive in the kind of defense that Pete Carroll would run if Pete Carroll were to run the defense his way and not Mike Zimmer's way. So it's not the hire that I would necessarily make, but I also think like it makes a lot of sense. It checks a lot of boxes. Brandon, you talked about Pete Carroll as well, and I think we all kind of agree it does make sense, especially if you're trying to groom Jason Witten for that head coaching job. Like, who better than someone who has the history and experience that Pete Carroll does, and also, is going to need a successor before long. Whereas a guy even like Brian Schottenheimer, he's not exactly the youngest coach out there, but he's also not. I mean, Schottenheimer is not halfway to retirement either. So, but Brandon, who's your choice? Who's the name that you want to lead the Dallas Cowboys?
I mean, at this stage of the game, it's kind of, it's not the sexy names. Like I'm not putting Deion Sanders out there. I don't think that's happening.
Thank you.
But
Please
I don't see that. I think it'll be a guy like, it could be a guy like Anthony Lynn. I mean, Anthony Lynn's been around. He's been around the block a long time. 2-time Super Bowl champion with John Elway and those Broncos of the late 90s. So like he was on the roster. So he's got that Super Bowl pedigree. He's been around the game as a player coach since 1992. I've been coaching, I believe, since 2000. So it's like 25 years, give or take. But he's been around the league a long time. He's a very well-respected coach. I don't know if you guys caught it on ESPN's NFL Countdown this past week. Rex Ryan obviously gave him a very strong endorsement, and Rex would know him very well because they've spent a lot of time together. I mean, he was on the staff with the Jets and the Bills. And here's the other kicker. He's a Texas guy. He grew up. I might be saying this wrong because I am not from Texas, so I don't know if this is the right way. But is it Salina?
Salina.
Salina. Thank you. Yeah, we say Salina up here a little bit differently. So it's we ours is a Salina is how we say Salina up here.
I have a friend that spells her name that way. So like. I'm also not from Texas, but I've learned how to say things right because I've been corrected a lot. Like, one thing about Texas, they will correct you, and they're not.
100%.
They're like Salina, and I'm like,
I'm a New Yorker, so it's like I've been down there, and they're like, "You're a Yankee." I'm like, "No, I don't root for that team." So like I've definitely had that happen when I was down there. But with Anthony Lynn, like he's from the Metroplex, like he grew up in the area, so like he knows it. He played his ball at Texas Tech, which is in Lubbock. Like it's he's been around the game his entire life. He's a Texas guy, so he has that pedigree where he's very well respected by. I don't think there's anybody out there that has rubbed elbows at Anthony Lynn and can't say they wouldn't say anything bad about the man because like he's just very well respected. Plus he's won more than he's lost in the NFL. Like I believe he's above 500 NFL coach with the Chargers. Like he's also right now. He's on staff with Dan Quinn as the running game coordinator, and that running game top 3. I mean, they're only behind the Baltimore Ravens and the Philadelphia Eagles. Last time I checked, those two teams were pretty good at the run game all year. So to be in that category, just slightly below them and ahead of Dan Campbell's Detroit Lions, I think he's doing a pretty good job there. I think he could be a stabilizing factor. I mean, I think he's the kind of guy that you'll get the most out of your players. I think he's a player's coach. He's old school, but he is also new school, where he knows how to approach a lot of the younger guys. I mean, it's a different game than when he played in the 90s and coached in the early 2000s. So it's a different world. But Anthony Lynn is well respected. He's a Texas guy. I mean, to me, if that's the name, I'm okay with it. But also, I wouldn't be upset if maybe he comes on as offensive coordinator. He goes from run game coordinator to offensive coordinator. So even if Anthony Lynn he makes the jump to Dallas again because he was here 20 years ago, that would be cool. I wouldn't mind seeing that. And don't be surprised if if Zim's out of the picture. Leslie Frazier could be a name as well. I mean, Leslie Frazier's a very well respected defensive mind. So I mean, there's a lot of quality names out there. They're more so for me, more coordinators than they are head coaches. But Anthony Lynn, he's won more than he's lost as a head coach. At this stage of the game, I think he'd be a really good stabilizing factor. I just don't know if he wants to be a part of the circus known as Jerry Jones and the Dallas Cowboys.
Yeah, and of course he was on the staff under Bill Parcells. So in addition to being from Texas, he's been inside the belly of the beast.
Yeah.
So maybe that colors his perception of the job as well, depending on how things went when Bill Parcells was the head coach. But I mean, to your point, Brandon, though, I think it's a good pull. I think Anthony Lynn, he did a good job with the Chargers. He actually he was the head coach there when they transitioned from Phillip Rivers to Justin Herbert, and Herbert had that phenomenal rookie year. With I believe Shane Steichen was his offensive coordinator, but Anthony Lynn was the head coach. The two were very involved in that offense. Shane Steichen is the Colts head coach currently. And Anthony Lynn actually was, people forget this, he was the first offensive coordinator in Detroit under Dan Campbell, because they knew each other from their days back in Dallas as well when Dan Campbell played for the Cowboys. And they brought him in as their offensive coordinator. Obviously, that first year did not go as they had planned. Anthony Lynn didn't quite. He and Jared Goff never had the connection that Ben Johnson had with Jared Goff, and that led to the change there. But even to this day, both Anthony Lynn and Dan Campbell speak very highly of each other. They left on good terms. So that's another guy who, everyone's talking about Ben Johnson, everyone's talking about Aaron Glenn. Anthony Lynn culturally was a strong fit with Dan Campbell and what he wanted to do from an early stage. When he left Detroit, he went to the 49ers, was the assistant head coach there, working along Kyle Shanahan, who we already talked about, getting a guy with that Shanahan tree. And then of course his experience in Washington this past year. I think it would be a good hire, but that also tells me they're not going to do it. So,
yeah,
two good names that have already been thrown out. Last week, I said, my pick still is Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores. I think he's going to be a star wherever he ends up going. If it's a job this year, if it's a job next year, but it seems pretty obvious at this point he's not coming to Dallas. I didn't think that was realistic anyway for several reasons, but
yeah. So
the coach that I want, I'm limiting myself now to coaches that have interviewed with the team. Of course, that limits it to 4. But of the coaches that they've interviewed, the one that I would want the most is Robert Saleh, the former Jets head coach. And, again, I'll preface by saying, I'm not banging the table for Robert Saleh, but of the 4 guys that you've interviewed already, this is the one I'm taking. And it's pretty simple. I mean, the guy is, he is known first and foremost as a great culture setter. When the Jets fired him this year, players were shocked. Players were upset. They were sad to see him go. Usually when you fire a coach in the middle of the year, it's because the players want him gone. Like, he's lost the locker room, and then they come out and play great in that first game because they're like, thank God that guy's gone. Like what we saw with Josh McDaniels with first the Broncos, then the Raiders. And that didn't happen with the Jets. They got worse after he was gone.
Yeah.
And I mean, he never once lost the locker room. He never had a winning season in 3 1/4 years in New York. So it's not like he won a lot of games, but he never once lost that locker room through tons and tons of things that most coaches would. On top of that, he's, a brilliant defensive mind. Again, comes from that Pete Carroll background, coached alongside Dan Quinn in Seattle, and then went to Jacksonville, ran that defense with the 49ers. And we know how good the 49ers have been on defense. The Jets were also really good on defense when he was still the head coach as well. So you've got that defensive scheme. You've got a guy who's, a veritable leader and motivator. And then looking at the offense, he had two different offensive coordinators with the Jets. One was Mike LaFleur, brother of Matt LaFleur, and could potentially be available again. He's currently the Rams offensive coordinator, but he doesn't call plays, so he might leave for a play calling job somewhere else. And then Nathaniel Hackett, who they largely brought in to lure Aaron Rodgers, which worked. He had previously been the offensive coordinator for Matt LaFleur. So again, coming from that Shanahan-LaFleur tree of offensive schemes, I look at that and I'm like, you're telling me I can get, that Legion of Boom defense, I can get a Shanahan-style offense and somebody who's a great locker room leader? The only thing that makes me nervous is, again, his best record in a season was 7-10. But again, then you look at the players he had to work with, he'd have a much better roster in Dallas than he ever had in New York. But that does make me nervous. But that's what pushes me to say, if we're picking from these four guys, I'm going with Robert Saleh. But none of them are going to be Kenny Dillingham out of Arizona State. So
or Fran Brown at Syracuse, we know.
Yeah. He had to settle.
Okay. Well, if we're going with people we're picking out of the interviews, I'm going Shotty.
Okay.
I'm going Brian Schottenheimer.
I don't hate it.
I'm not going Kellen Moore. I'll tell you right now. That would not happen. If I ever say that would be my head coach pick, I'm in trouble. That's my SOS.
That's your SOS.
That's my SOS. And look, if Kellen comes to Dallas and we have to see what that experience is like, it makes me nervous only because I was here when he was OC, and I remember everyone's so quick to forget. I remember what the players were actually saying about it. That offensive scheme that Kellen was trying to run, I'm not going to say they were like, thank God Kellen's gone. No, they like Kellen. They like Kellen, but they were like, oh, we feel like we can breathe again under McCarthy's playbook. It was night and day. So for me, unless he's learned to kind of have more of an open door policy for players' input and understand what you're working with as far as who you have on your roster, I don't think he's ready for a head coaching position at that point, unless that aspect of his coaching has grown. Because just talking to some of the guys in the locker room my first year about the scheme and about, the change when it did happen, more people were pleased that it happened than not. And I'll leave it at that, but I remember that very well. And I'm not sure if Kellen has changed that philosophy and thinking, or if that's who he wants to be as a coach. And if that's the case, I'm really okay with not seeing that experiment come to Dallas again. So, I'm very hard out on Kellen because of that reason. And it's become kind of like a running joke, right? But genuinely there's reasons behind it. And, some of the guys that I talked to that first year are still currently in the locker room. So I will say if he's changed and he's grown that philosophy, I'm willing to give it a shot. It's just, if that's the case, I'm going Schottenheimer. Out of our four,
you're willing to give it a shot, but you'd rather take a Schottenheimer.
Yeah, Schottenheimer. Yeah, very nice. Well done.
Thank you. I pretty much agree with you, Jess, though, on your analysis of Kellen Moore. I think there's been times when he was the offensive coordinator where when that offense is clicking, it's a thing of beauty.
Yeah.
But then there's also times where it does not click, and more often than not, the times that it doesn't click, Kellen more often than time. But the times that it doesn't click is in the biggest moments, like the playoffs against the 49ers 2 straight years, or this past week against
safety. That's safety. Oof. What was that?
Yeah, no, your quarterback just put a brace on his knee. You're backed up inside the 15. Your quarterback's already been sacked 5 times, and you call a 7-step drop, and then you're surprised that he gets sacked for a safety?
Ridiculous.
I mean,
Not good. Not good.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
No.
maybe he wouldn't be calling the plays. So if he took the head coaching position, that could mean he's alleviated of calling the plays, right?
but then you're in the same question where, like, when Mike
Right,
McCarthy came to Dallas, and people were like, "Well, why are we hiring him if it's not for him to call plays? Because that's what he does."
Yeah.
And of course, you know how that all went, and he ended up calling the plays eventually anyway.
Here's
so,
my
like,
question to you guys. Why are we not talking about Joe Brady? Like, look what's going on in Buffalo. Like, why? I know they're still in the
same
playoffs.
reason we're not talking about Ben Johnson.
Yeah.
Like, it's
not
like,
going to happen. That's why we're being realistic here.
Yeah, I know it's frustrating because there's so many great coaches out there that, like, they're on the cusp of being a really good head coach. Like, I think Ben Johnson's going to do a heck of a job with Caleb Williams. And it's like the Cowboys, it's like they do with free agency. They go to the, they shop in the clearance rack, essentially. It's like guys that have never been coaches.
Clearance rack. Don't even.
Well, I don't hate it, but like when it comes to like coaches and stuff, it's like, all right, we're just gonna go to Five Below, essentially. It's like, what are we doing here?
Five Below.
Five Below is great.
Now this is getting offensive in here.
Yeah, Five Below is amazing.
The point.
I know what you're saying.
Is, though, they're not going after they're not going after these hot names.
Yeah.
It's like guys that have not coached, at head coach, like a Schottenheimer, no offense, or it's like they're gonna go after maybe a Pete Carroll, who there's a reason why he's not there in the league right now. I mean,
that's the situation you're in, though, because one, you weren't aggressive sooner, and two, you waited until the last minute to have a conversation with Mike McCarthy, who pulled the Uno reverse on you. Like, that's what happened.
Hey, you know what though? Good on McCarthy on that, by the way.
That's
like,
what
you know
saying.
what?
Like, we love a king that knows his self-worth. Self-worth king. I love that.
I wish McCarthy all the best.
Here's the scenario that I really, really more than anything want to have happen is because, Mike McCarthy interviewed for the Bears job. That's obviously filled now with Ben Johnson. He's on his way to New Orleans to talk with the Saints. The weather has thrown some of those things off. The Saints have pushed other interviews back. So we'll see what happens there. I really want this to happen where Jerry Jones calls him back up and says, "Hey, can we talk again?" And like sends him like the "you up" text. And basically like McCarthy comes back and is like, "My demands haven't changed." And then Jerry caves and brings him back and on his terms.
Jerry's
and
not
I'm
caving.
not saying it's going to happen.
Yeah, Jerry's not
I want that to happen. One, because like you
guys said,
he shouldn't have been. He shouldn't have.
To see McCarthy come back. Look, we all agree here. He shouldn't have. It shouldn't have been put in the position where he decided to leave on his own terms. Right, he should have felt like there was something for him to stay for, and I think it's not even anything in the locker room. I don't think this has to do with locker room personnel or anything of that terms. I just think like, yeah, man, when you're a Cowboys head coach, it's so much more different than any other head coach. The amount of BS you constantly have to put up with is tenfold of any other team. And Mike handled it with grace. And I mean, really, you look at what other team has to listen to their owner / GM on the radio every week, contradicting what you said in a press conference earlier that week. Like, you don't hear it. That's only the Cowboys.
It takes a special person to be a head coach of the Cowboys. Simple as that.
It does, and Mike handled it so well. So I don't see him coming back. Truly, I just don't see it happening. And Mike also has to think stability for his family because he does have younger daughters. Like he has younger kids to think about here too. So I would love for Mike to just be like, yes, you know what? Just kidding. JK, on my way. But like, that's not going to happen. Yeah. I think realistically, the four you have, I don't see that list growing tenfold, even in the next week or 2 weeks. I just see it. I see it being significantly behind the other teams as it stands now. I don't see that pattern changing. So I think, as long as we start to kind of brace ourselves or whatever higher, that's the best we can do right now. And it sucks, but you know what? Once it's done, it's done. And then you can start worrying about the other problems, like my biggest fear is the amount of free agents and impactful players that you cannot afford to let walk out that door. And if you do, you're in a worse position again. Like,
Yeah, just get the deal done. Get something done. That's it.
Anything. I shouldn't say that. You know what? No, I'm
No,
not.
yeah.
A good head coach, please.
Yeah.
Hey, out of the blue can work. I mean, I know at the collegiate level. I mean, you've seen it, Howman with Arizona State. I've seen it with Syracuse. Out of the blue hires have worked. So,
well,
you never know.
Herm Edwards didn't exactly work at Arizona State.
I mean,
yeah, but hey, Kenny worked though, and Franz worked. So maybe something could happen at the NFL level with the Cowboys. I'm just being hopeful here. Okay.
I love your optimism.
Yeah, I love it.
Do. It's really nice. I need it.
It's
but
so sweet.
But it's the Cowboys.
But I'm just prepared. Look, if you just don't expect anything, you can never be disappointed. And that's really how you have to take this offseason, because you're in for a lot of disappointment, unfortunately, depending on who the head coaching hire is, what staff decides to stay or go, where they decide to stay or where they decide to go, I should say. Free agents who could potentially be leaving, and the turnover rate, potentially the lack of free agency inquiries, and draft. I mean, truly, like, you have to brace yourself for what could absolutely not happen this offseason. And I think if you take it that way, look, you're solid. You can always be optimistic, and that's just that's where I'm at. I'm just here, I'm just here listening to
just
Taylor
rolling,
Swift, keeping my zen, just
that's all you can do.
Taking it day by day.
By moment sometimes,
Exactly.
like that's all we can do. We're human,
right? And I think that's a beautiful
Cowboys.
note to tie a bow on as we wrap up. Is day by day, week by week. Of course, we'll be here week by week at the Writer's Block talking all things Cowboys, and maybe the next time that you're listening to us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, wherever it is that you get your podcasts, there might be a head coach by then. There could also potentially be another, definitely the front runner of the coaching search. We'll see how all of these things unfold, but until next week, until we get more developments in this head coaching search, thank you all for listening. Thank you to Jess Nevarez for joining us to talk.
Thank you, Jess.
Through all of this. Always a pleasure having you on, friend of the show. For Brandon Clements, I'm David Howman, signing off. And before we officially go, Jess, I want you to have the opportunity to give a energetic, enthusiastic, how about them Cowboys for all of us.
Okay. All right. Here I go. Those acting lessons really are going to come in handy. Ready? How about them Cowboys?